Okay, so you sent over a ton of articles about Mozambique, and wow, this situation is really heating up. Protests, disputed elections, even like talk of a potential civil war. It feels like there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, it's definitely complex, and honestly, it's kind of wild how fast things escalated after
Hmm.
the elections back in October.
Yeah, it's crazy how quickly things went south. And you know me, I'm always looking for the bigger picture, the so what. Like, what does all of this actually mean? Not just for Mozambique, but for the whole region.
Right. Well, it seems like a lot of it hinges on this disputed election. The incumbent party, Frelimo, they were declared the winner, but the opposition candidate, Venâncio Mondlane, he rejected the results completely.
And didn't their constitutional council, kind of like their Supreme Court for elections, didn't they actually uphold those results, even with all those accusations of irregularities in the voting?
Yeah, which is surprising because, get this, none of the parties involved have actually come forward with any hard evidence to back up their claims.
So not even the constitutional council. That's kind of wild.
Not even them, which is concerning because it really undermines the legitimacy of the whole election.
Right. So it's not even a he said, she said thing. There's just like a lack of proof all around.
Exactly. And that raises some serious questions about the state of democracy in Mozambique.
Well, yeah. I mean, when people lose faith in the system itself, that's when things can get really shaky.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing that play out right now with all of these protests. Monlane's calling this new wave of protests his Turbo V8 stage. Wait, Turbo V8? What's that all about?
Honestly, I'm not totally sure about the name itself, but I think he's using it to signal a more intense phase in the demonstrations. He's basically calling for his supporters to escalate their actions, and unfortunately, that's led to a lot of violence and destruction.
Yeah, some of these articles you sent are pretty intense. I mean, we're talking looting, arson attacks on Frelimo, offices and police stations, even businesses getting destroyed. It just sounds really chaotic.
Yeah, it is. And tragically, over 250 people have been reported killed since October. There are even reports that the police are using excessive force, firing into crowds.
So I can definitely see why some people are forming vigilante groups to try and protect their neighborhoods. But that also feels like it could make things even worse, adding to the chaos.
Yeah, that's the dilemma, isn't it? When people feel like the government can't or won't protect them, they'll sometimes feel like they have to take matters into their own hands, and that creates a whole new set of problems.
It sounds like daily life for ordinary Mozambicans has become incredibly difficult. I was reading about Maputo practically turning into a ghost town over Christmas. And fuel shortages, people waiting hours just to buy bread.
Right, it's a bad situation. They're caught in the middle of this political power struggle, and their lives are being turned upside down.
And then, right on top of all of this, Mondlane comes back from exile on January 9th and just straight up declares himself president at the airport. What a way to make an entrance.
It was definitely a bold move, no question about it. He'd been organizing these protests from afar, but by coming back, he's seriously raising the stakes. It's setting the stage for a direct confrontation with the government.
And with the official presidential inauguration set for January 15th, the same day Mondlane says he'll be taking power, this whole situation just feels like a powder keg.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
There have been some calls for an interim transitional government, almost like a pause button. Bring in a neutral team to try and cool things down. Do you think that could actually work?
It feels like a long shot to me. With all the distrust and animosity, would Frelimo really be willing to share power or even step aside? I mean, they've been in power for almost 50 years.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, especially with the accusations that they've stolen votes in past elections and the skepticism around this one.
So you mentioned this idea of an interim government. How would that actually work in practice? I mean, what would need to happen to actually make it successful?
I think it would really come down to inclusivity. You'd need to have civil society leaders, all the major political parties, and crucially, all the presidential candidates involved,
Yeah.
both the current president and Mondlane.
Well, you mentioned earlier that none of the parties are actually providing evidence for their claims. Do you think that ties into this? The lack of transparency, is that maybe why people are turning to those vigilante groups?
Yeah, it really does feel like that lack of transparency from the top is trickling down, fueling the distrust and fear that's driving people to take things into their own hands. But if this interim government is such a long shot, are there any other potential paths forward?
Well, one idea that keeps coming up is bringing in international mediators, people who can try and facilitate dialogue between all the different groups.
Okay, so who are we talking about?
Well, there's one name that keeps popping up, Thabo Mbeki.
The former South African president.
Yeah.
Why him? Well, he's got this really impressive track record when it comes to mediating conflicts, especially on the African continent. A lot of leaders in the region really respect him. He's got that reputation for being a fair and skilled diplomat.
So he could be the key to getting everyone to the table and talking, but the big question is, will they actually talk? Will Frelimo actually be open to compromising after all these years in power?
That's the real sticking point. They've been criticized for not wanting to share power in the past and for their handling of past elections. There's just a lot of skepticism about whether they genuinely engage in a process that could lead to them losing their grip on power.
I read that some people think South Africa shouldn't get involved at all, that it should be up to Mozambique to work this out on their own. What do you think about that?
It's a tough one. On the one hand, there's definitely a valid argument for respecting Mozambique's sovereignty, letting them find their own solutions. But on the other hand, this situation is so volatile, it could easily destabilize the entire region. And South Africa, as a neighbor, they have a vested interest in making sure peace and stability are restored.
So it's this balancing act between respecting sovereignty and recognizing that sometimes things are so messy you need outside help to get things back on track.
Exactly. And it's super important that if there is any intervention, it's done carefully and with the full consent and cooperation of the Mozambican people.
Okay, so let's just say for argument's sake that Mbeki does come in and somehow manages to get everyone to actually sit down at the negotiating table. What are the key things they'd need to address to find a way out of this crisis?
Well, first things first, they need to figure out how to restore trust in the electoral process.
Okay, how do you even begin to do that?
Well, it might involve doing some kind of independent audit of these election results, putting in place some electoral reforms that'll ensure more transparency in the future, maybe even committing to having new elections that are monitored by international observers.
And what about the violence? The vigilante groups? What do you do about that?
That's a really tough one. There needs to be a plan for disarming these groups and figuring out how to reestablish the rule of law. But the thing is, that can only really happen if people actually believe that the government can keep them safe.
So it's a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah, pretty much. You need security to build trust, but you also need trust to build security. And then on top of that, you can't forget about all those underlying economic and social problems that are contributing to the unrest in the first place. Issues like poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, those all need to be addressed if you're talking about any kind of long-term solution.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, to feel like there's just no way out. But are there any, signs of hope? Anything that makes you think Mozambique might actually be able to pull back from the brink?
I think the fact that there are people calling for dialogue, both within Mozambique and from the international community, is a good sign.
So that's something.
It is, because it shows that at least people are starting to realize that there's not going to be some easy military solution.
And Mondlane coming back, as risky as it was, could that maybe actually be a good thing, like a catalyst for change?
It's possible, yeah. He's definitely forced the issue out into the open, made it something no one can ignore anymore. And by coming back, he's putting himself on the line. It shows a level of commitment that might actually inspire others to step up and demand change, too.
Okay, so as we get closer to January 15th, the day of the official inauguration and the day Mondlane says he's going to assume power, what do you think is the most likely scenario? What could actually happen?
It's really hard to predict with any certainty. There are a few different ways this could play out. I think the best case scenario, though maybe a little optimistic, is that Frelimo actually recognizes how serious this is and agrees to some kind of power-sharing arrangement.
Okay, so what would that look like?
It could be an interim government, or maybe a commitment to holding new elections. But the important thing would be finding a way to bring the temperature down and create space for some real, honest dialogue.
That's the optimistic route. What's the worst case scenario?
Well, the worst case, and this is a very real possibility, is that Frelimo just digs in their heels and refuses to negotiate at all, that they see Mondlane coming back as this direct challenge to their authority, and they respond with force.
Like a violent crackdown.
Exactly. And if that happens, it could easily throw the country into a full-blown civil war with devastating consequences.
It's scary to even think about. And what about Mondlane? Is there a chance he might back down from his claim to the presidency?
It's hard to imagine him doing that at this point. He's made his position clear, he's mobilized his supporters, and he's even accusing Frelimo of orchestrating a campaign of violence against his followers. He might feel like he has no choice but to stand his ground.
So we're really on the edge of a knife here.
We are. So much is at stake. The future of democracy in Mozambique, stability in the whole region, the lives of so many people.
It's heavy stuff. And the next few days are going to be crucial. This isn't just some far-off problem. What happens in Mozambique could end up impacting the whole region. And that means it affects you directly. It's a reminder that we're all connected, even in our globalized world. It makes you wonder, with everything going on in Mozambique right now, what does this all say about the state of democracy in Africa as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, Mozambique's situation is definitely not unique. It kind of highlights some of the bigger systemic problems a lot of democracies are facing across the continent.
Like, what kind of problems? Give us the big picture view.
Well, one of the biggest issues is just a lack of strong institutions. When things like the Electoral Commission or the judiciary are seen as biased or corrupt, it really undermines people's trust in the whole system.
So it's not enough to just have elections. You have to have elections that people actually believe in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for that to happen, you need independent institutions that can oversee the process fairly. If you don't have that, elections can just become a way for those in power to stay in power, instead of a way for people to actually have their voices heard.
And sadly, we've seen that happen over and over again in different parts of Africa. Leaders clinging to power, rigging elections, silencing anyone who disagrees with them.
Right. It's a pattern that undermines the whole idea of democracy and creates a lot of instability.
Absolutely. And, we can't forget about the role of poverty and inequality in all of this. When so many people are struggling to survive, it's easy to see how that could breed resentment and make people more vulnerable to those who offer simple solutions or scapegoats.
Yeah, when people are desperate, they're more likely to go to extremes. And in a fragile democracy, that can be really dangerous.
It's like that thing we were talking about earlier. Youth unemployment in Mozambique is incredibly high. When young people don't see a future for themselves, it's not surprising that they might be drawn to more radical ideas.
Absolutely. And then you have to factor in the legacy of colonialism. A lot of African countries are dealing with borders that were drawn up by European powers, often dividing up ethnic groups and creating tensions that can be easily exploited.
So even though we're talking about the present, the past is still playing a huge role.
Definitely. Those historical factors, mixed with present-day challenges like corruption, weak governance, and limited access to things like education and opportunity, it creates a really complex and volatile situation.
It's honestly starting to feel a little overwhelming. Is there even anything that can be done to strengthen democracy in Africa, given all of these obstacles?
Well, it's definitely not easy, but I do think there are some reasons to be hopeful. Across the continent, we're seeing this new generation coming up, young people who are demanding more from their governments.
So a new generation with different expectations.
Right. They're tech savvy, they're connected, and they're a lot less tolerant of the way things have always been done.
That's encouraging.
Yeah. And we're also seeing a more active civil society emerging. More organizations and individuals who are speaking out for human rights, for good governance, and for democratic reforms. They're the ones holding leaders accountable and pushing for greater transparency.
It sounds like a real fight for the future is happening.
It is, and it's a fight that's absolutely worth having. I think the future of Africa really hinges on whether democratic values can take root and actually flourish.
So bringing it back to Mozambique, do you think this whole crisis could end up being a turning point, for better or for worse?
It's too early to say for sure, but I think it could go either way. If the key players, and that includes Frelimo, if they can use this as an opportunity to have some real conversations and make some compromises, it could actually create a path toward a more inclusive and democratic future for Mozambique.
But if they don't?
The consequences could be disastrous, and not just for Mozambique. This is a reminder that democracy is fragile, even in places where it's been fought for and won.
Well, that's a lot to think about. It's going to be interesting to see what happens on January 15th. Will dialogue win out? Or will things spiral even further into violence? The stakes are incredibly high. But one thing's for sure, this is a story we need to keep our eyes on. We all need to stay informed and keep asking those tough questions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the situation in Mozambique.